In the early morning hours of April 28th in the year 1903, the earth under the town of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey began to shake violently. It was sudden, intense, and completely unexpected. A powerful earthquake struck the region, reaching a surface wave magnitude of 7.0. For the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. Manzikert, which today lies in Muş province, sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The ground beneath eastern Turkey is under constant pressure because it lies along the boundaries of major tectonic plates. The Arabian plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate from the south, while the Anatolian plate, which holds most of Turkey, is being squeezed and pushed westward. This collision zone has produced earthquakes for thousands of years and still does today. Back in 1903, there were no early warning systems. People had no way to prepare for what was coming. The shaking began without warning, and within minutes, homes, buildings, and entire neighborhoods had crumbled. The earthquake caused massive destruction across the region. 12,000 homes were completely destroyed. Not damaged, gone, flattened. For people living in rural villages with simple stone or mud brick homes, there was no protection when the earth turned violent. The shaking was so strong that the ground split in places, and landslides were triggered in nearby hills. Thousands of animals, over 20,000, died, many crushed in collapsed barns or caught in the chaos that followed. For a region that relied heavily on agriculture and livestock to survive, losing that many animals was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of livelihood. But the most heartbreaking toll was the human one. An estimated 3,500 people were killed in the disaster. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. Survivors were left digging through the ruins with their bare hands, searching for anyone who might still be alive. The sound of weeping and shouting filled the air in the hours after the shaking stopped. Nearby cities and towns like Erzurum and Bitlis felt the earthquake too. Though the damage there was less severe, buildings cracked and panic spread. Roads and trails used for travel became blocked by debris, making rescue efforts even harder. And because this was the early 20th century, there were no helicopters, no quick emergency teams. Help came slowly, by foot, by cart, or not at all. The people of Manzikert had no choice but to rely on each other. Neighbors helped neighbors, even while grieving their own losses. Makeshift shelters were set up using whatever materials could be found. Fires were lit to keep warm at night, as many were forced to sleep outside in the cold. The strong aftershocks kept coming, making it impossible for people to feel safe indoors. This earthquake would go on to be remembered as one of the deadliest in Turkish history. But it was only the beginning of the hardship. The full impact of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would be felt for years to come. As the days passed after the earthquake struck Manzikert, the damage began to reveal itself even more clearly. Survivors who had crawled out from collapsed homes began walking through their villages, seeing entire streets reduced to rubble. Stone walls had collapsed inward, roofs had caved in, and the narrow dirt roads were blocked with debris. In many places, there was nothing left standing. The landscape looked as though it had been torn apart by war. Relief was slow to arrive. In the early 1900s, the region was isolated. With limited infrastructure, there were no paved highways or motor vehicles. The only ways to reach Manzikert were by foot, horseback, or donkey carts, and the trails were damaged or blocked by landslides. News of the earthquake spread slowly. Weeks went by before help from distant cities began to trickle in. In the meantime, the survivors had to rely entirely on local resources. Many had lost everything. Families were now homeless, living in temporary shelters made from wooden planks and canvas, or huddling in caves and open fields. With their livestock gone and food supplies buried under rubble, hunger and illness started to take hold. Clean water was scarce, and without proper sanitation, diseases quickly began to spread. It was no longer just an earthquake disaster, it was now a humanitarian crisis. The psychological toll on the survivors was heavy. Every aftershock brought fresh fear. People were afraid to sleep indoors, even in buildings that were still standing. Children cried at the sound of the ground rumbling, and adults kept one eye on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that signaled a new collapse or landslide. Entire communities were gripped by fear and uncertainty. Beyond Manzikert, the earthquake was felt across much of eastern Anatolia. In cities like Erzurum and Bitlis, the shaking caused damage to important structures. Mosques, markets, and schools showed signs of cracking, and some smaller buildings collapsed. Though the destruction was not as complete as in Manzikert, it served as a reminder of just how far-reaching the earthquake had been. Even regions not directly in the epicenter were affected economically and emotionally. In the countryside surrounding Manzikert, farmers were devastated. The land had shifted, irrigation systems were damaged or destroyed, fields were torn apart, and in some areas, the soil had been displaced so badly that planting crops was no longer possible. Entire growing seasons were lost. Combined with the deaths of 20,000 animals, it meant that famine was now a looming threat. The Ottoman authorities at the time did what they could, but the response was limited. There was no central disaster agency, no stockpile of supplies, no formal rescue teams. Aid depended heavily on local governors, religious leaders, and community volunteers. Donations were sent from neighboring provinces, and religious institutions helped organize relief, but resources were stretched thin. The disaster exposed the vulnerability of rural communities in eastern Turkey. Most homes had been built from sun-dried bricks or local stones, materials that stood no chance against a major quake. The collapse of these homes wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a sign of how unprepared the region was for a natural disaster of this size. In the weeks that followed, the people of Manzikert began the slow process of digging out what they could. Personal belongings were retrieved from the ruins, but for many, there was little to find. Entire family histories, photos, books, heirlooms had been buried or burned. Yet amid the loss, there were small moments of hope. People who had been presumed dead were found alive, buried under beams or inside pockets of collapsed rooms, rescued by neighbors who refused to give up searching. The memory of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would remain etched in the minds of the survivors for the rest of their lives. But this was only the early phase of a much longer journey. Recovery would take years, and the scars left by the earthquake, both physical and emotional, would run deep. Months after the earthquake, the people of Manzikert were still struggling to return to anything close to normal. The summer heat arrived, bringing with it new challenges. With so many buildings destroyed and clean water supplies either buried or contaminated, sanitation had become a serious problem. Flies gathered around waste and rotting animal carcasses that had not been properly buried. Sickness was spreading rapidly. Typhoid and dysentery were common. With limited medical knowledge and no modern hospitals nearby, even treatable illnesses became deadly. The destruction of homes and livestock had left thousands of people dependent on whatever help they could get. Food shortages were growing worse. Crops planted earlier in the spring had withered in fields that could no longer be properly irrigated. Entire harvests had failed. Families were now relying on donated grains, dried fruits, and whatever animals they had managed to save. The loss of 20,000 animals was not just a number. It meant fewer plows, no milk, no transportation, and no meat for entire communities. Despite the devastation, some rebuilding efforts had started. Using what materials they could find, wood, salvaged bricks, mud, people began putting up temporary homes. These makeshift shelters offered little protection against the weather, but they were a sign that the town was not giving up. Stonemasons and laborers came from neighboring villages to help, even though many of them had suffered losses themselves. In the absence of formal engineering knowledge, homes were rebuilt in much the same way they had been before, leaving them just as vulnerable to future quakes. Religious leaders played a big role during this time. Mosques that had survived the shaking became gathering places not only for worship, but for organizing food distribution and community decisions. Clerics gave sermons focused on strength and perseverance, and many people found comfort and faith when there was little else to hold onto. Beyond the town itself, the government had begun taking notes. The Ottoman Empire, still in its final decades, was under pressure from multiple sides, financially, politically, and militarily. Natural disasters like the Manzikert quake only added more stress. Officials sent reports back to Istanbul detailing the destruction, and engineers were dispatched to evaluate the damage. While resources were limited, the disaster helped push the discussion about earthquake risks into broader political conversations. Meanwhile, researchers of the time began paying closer attention to the geology of the region. Though modern seismology was still in its infancy, it was becoming clear that eastern Anatolia was resting on unstable ground. Scientists noted that the region was close to the junction between two major fault systems, the East Anatolian Fault and the North Anatolian Fault. These faults were now being studied more closely, and there were early theories forming about the movement of plates and how stress in the Earth's crust could build over time until it suddenly released in a violent quake. In addition to the main earthquake in April, there were multiple aftershocks over the following weeks and months. One of the more powerful ones struck on the 6th of August, causing new damage to buildings that had survived the initial quake. Some people who had started rebuilding saw their homes collapse again. A few were injured, and the fear that had briefly started to fade came roaring back. Many residents began questioning whether it was even safe to remain in the region. Despite the suffering, people found ways to survive. Communities worked together, sharing tools, food, and even space. Entire families moved in together under single roofs. Children played in the dust and rubble, finding moments of laughter amid the hardship. Weddings were still held, funerals still observed, and markets slowly reopened. Bit by bit, life was continuing, even if it looked completely different than before. For the people of Manzikert, the earthquake had not just destroyed buildings, it had changed the rhythm of their lives, shifted their priorities, and forced them to rethink how they would live in a land that could shake without warning. But they kept going, one day at a time, trying to rebuild not just their homes, but the future. In the years that followed the 1903 Manzikert earthquake, the tragedy stayed fresh in people's memories. Survivors carried the weight of what they had seen and lost. Family members buried under collapsed roofs, animals crushed in barns, entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. The ground beneath their feet had once felt solid, dependable. Now every tremor, every creak of a shifting house beam sparked a fear that was hard to forget. Across the region, this earthquake became one of the key moments that helped shift how people understood natural disasters. Before then, earthquakes were often seen as acts of fate or divine punishment, unpredictable and unavoidable. But the scale of the Manzikert disaster forced people to ask new questions. Could something like this happen again? Was it possible to prepare or even to prevent such destruction? At the time, formal earthquake science was still very limited, especially in eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire. There were no warning systems, no emergency response plans, and little public understanding of how earthquakes worked. But slowly that began to change. Scholars and engineers began paying more attention to the fault lines running through the Anatolian region. Reports were written, diagrams drawn, and early versions of risk maps were developed by experts in Istanbul and abroad. The Ottoman government, though strained and declining, did begin to gather more earthquake data. They compiled damage reports from towns like Manzikert, Erzurum, and Bitlis. These records would later help future researchers understand which parts of the country were most at risk. The memory of the 1903 disaster also started conversations about the need for safer buildings, though large-scale changes in construction would not fully come into place until decades later. Even without modern engineering, local builders and masons began to change their methods. In the years after the quake, new homes were often made shorter with thicker walls and stronger support beams. People experimented with new materials when they gained a when they could get them, hoping to avoid the same total collapse if another quake hit. Though these improvements were small, they marked the start of a long journey toward earthquake-resistant design. The disaster also left behind lessons in human resilience. Communities that had been torn apart slowly rebuilt themselves. Fields were planted again. Children born after the quake grew up hearing stories of survival and loss. Local traditions of sharing and mutual aid grew stronger. In some villages, neighbors formed informal watch groups that kept an eye out for signs of danger, shifting rocks, strange animal behavior, or unusual ground movement. Manzikert itself never forgot what happened. For decades, the earthquake remained part of its identity. Stories were passed down from elders to children, describing the moment the earth cracked open and the dust swallowed everything. The quake had reshaped more than just the land. It had changed the way people lived, worked, and thought about their future. Across Turkey, the Manzikert quake is now remembered as one of the earliest major disasters of the 20th century. It helped lay the groundwork for future efforts in earthquake preparedness, though progress would take many years. By the end of the 20th century, more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had struck the country, killing more than 100,000 people and injuring many more. Each one added new urgency to the call for safety and preparedness. And today, Turkey has modern seismology centers, early warning systems, and strict building codes in many regions. These advances were not born overnight. They came from decades of hard lessons, of loss and recovery, and the 1903 Manzikert earthquake was one of the earliest and most painful lessons of all. The scars left behind by that earthquake are no longer visible in rubble, but they remain in the country's memory. They remind us of the quiet danger that lives beneath our feet and the strength that people can find when everything falls apart. In the days leading up to the deadly typhoon that struck Hong Kong in the early morning hours of Tuesday, September 18th of the year 1906, there was no real sign of the devastation that was about to unfold. Life in the city was moving along like usual. Hong Kong at the time was a growing British colony and a busy international port. Streets were filled with people going about their day, shopkeepers opening stores, boats crowding the harbor, trams running through the heart of the city, and locals navigating their daily routines. There had been storms before, of course. Typhoons weren't new to the region, but this one would end up being one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. The warning signs were subtle at first. The barometer began to drop steadily on the morning of the storm. Between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock that morning, the pressure fell from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. This might not mean much to the average person, but to those watching the skies, like the Hong Kong Observatory, it was clear that something serious was developing. Still, there wasn't much time. At 8:40 in the morning, a black drum was raised by the observatory, which was the official warning signal at the time for tropical cyclones. But this was barely 30 minutes before the full force of the typhoon hit. Unfortunately, this short notice left almost no time for preparations. By 9 o'clock, ferries had stopped operating, but it was already too late for many. Foreign steamer captains and their crews, stranded on land, had no time to reach their vessels and secure them. Some people didn't even realize the danger until it was upon them. That's how fast it moved. Despite some warnings being telegraphed days earlier from Japan and Shanghai, it wasn't until the morning of the 18th that most people in Hong Kong knew anything was wrong. It caught nearly everyone off guard. The typhoon itself had formed several days earlier, around Saturday, September 15th, near the Bashi Channel to the southeast of Hong Kong. It was first spotted by Japanese meteorologists east of Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan. Ships passing through the Pacific Ocean also recorded changes in wind and pressure. But back in Hong Kong, where communication systems were limited and weather tracking was still a developing science, the urgency of those early warnings didn't make their way to the people in time. By the time the typhoon approached Hong Kong, it had grown into a powerful storm with winds swirling around a massive core. The eye of the storm was recorded just 30 nautical miles away, with wind speeds reaching 24 miles per hour as it neared the city. While that might not sound extremely fast, what made this storm deadly was its sheer size and intensity. The wind force extended across an area about 100 miles in diameter. The winds were violent, but the real damage came from what followed: the rising water, the massive waves, and the terrifying storm surge. As people in the city began to realize that this was no ordinary storm, panic set in. Boats were rushed to shelter if they could make it, markets shut down. People ran for cover, trying to find solid ground or shelter indoors. The skies grew darker and the air grew heavier. For many, it was already too late to escape what was coming, and still no one could have predicted how bad things would get. The typhoon was just beginning its path of destruction, and within hours, it would change the city forever. As the sun rose over Hong Kong on the morning of Tuesday, September 18th, the air was thick and unusually still. Most residents were completely unaware that a massive storm was racing toward the city. At around 8:40 in the morning, the Royal Observatory hoisted the black drum signal, a warning system used since the year 1884 to alert of approaching tropical cyclones. Just minutes later, the typhoon gun was fired at the harbor, sounding the alarm that danger was imminent. But by that point, it was already too late for many. The typhoon had moved in fast. In just 2 hours, barometer readings dropped rapidly, from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. That kind of drop signaled a sudden and extreme pressure change, a sure sign of the approaching storm's intensity. By 9 in the morning, ferry services had already come to a halt, and people were stranded all across the harbor. Many foreign steamer crews couldn't reach their vessels in time to prepare, leaving countless ships vulnerable as the storm swept in. The winds picked up with terrifying speed. The Hong Kong Observatory measured a velocity of 24 miles per hour when the eye of the storm was still 30 nautical miles away. That might not sound fast at first, but with a storm of this scale, those winds carried an unstoppable force. In a matter of minutes, the sea became a boiling mess of churning waves and crashing surf. Tidal waves slammed against the shoreline, flooding entire coastal areas before anyone had time to react. Along the waterfront, the rising water broke down sea walls, carried away small boats, and smashed wooden piers to splinters. The typhoon's full power became tragically clear as it hit during high tide. Thousands of people living in vulnerable coastal areas were directly in its path. For many Chinese families living on houseboats, some of the nearly 5,000 registered watercraft in the city, there was no escape. The storm struck so quickly that few could make it to shore. Along the stretch from West Point to Causeway Bay, sampans and lighters were tossed into one another like toys. Entire communities living on the water disappeared in an instant. By mid-morning, buildings on land were also being torn apart. Roof tiles and glass rained down into the streets. Electric tram lines on Hong Kong Island came to a stop when wiring systems were ripped apart. The Peak tram was also forced to shut down after damage to its signal cables and nearby tracks. On Bowen Road, fallen trees and debris made entire routes impassable. At the Botanical Gardens, many trees were destroyed, although the zoological section somehow made it through untouched. The storm showed no mercy. At West Point, major warehouses, including those owned by Jardine, Matheson, and Jebson and Company, lost their roofs and had their walls ripped away. Piers collapsed across the Central District, including the Star Ferry Wharf, Blake Pier, and Queen's Statue Wharf. Even newly constructed landmarks like the General Post Office and the Supreme Court site were heavily damaged, their bamboo scaffolding torn down and scattered across nearby roads. This typhoon didn't just damage a few structures. It overwhelmed every part of life in Hong Kong, from transportation and housing to public safety and communication. And all of it happened in just a few short hours, leaving the city in shock and on its knees. But as devastating as this was, the true scale of the disaster would only become clear as people began searching for loved ones in the wreckage. Next, we'll look at the tragedy that unfolded in the harbor, with ships sunk, hundreds of lives lost, and heroic rescues carried out in the middle of the storm. As the typhoon continued its assault on Hong Kong, the waters of Victoria Harbor turned into a deadly trap. The chaos reached its peak between 10 in the morning and noon, when winds blew with hurricane force and the sea surged over the seawalls. The harbor, normally a place of trade and activity, became unrecognizable. Massive waves rose up without warning, some said to be over 30 feet high, crashing down on vessels of all sizes. More than 200 ships and boats were damaged or sunk. Among them were ferries, cargo steamers, and fishing junks. The Chung Shan, a large steamer, was thrown from its mooring and slammed into the dockside before capsizing. The Yunnan, another vessel anchored near Kowloon, broke free and collided with smaller boats before vanishing beneath the waves. The Japanese freighter Asama Maru, caught in the path of the storm while attempting to leave port, lost control and drifted until it struck a pier. Its hull was badly damaged, but it managed to remain afloat. Countless smaller boats were not so fortunate. Entire fleets of sampans, which served as both homes and workplaces for many families, were shattered by debris or dashed against sea walls. Witnesses later described seeing people clinging to pieces of wreckage or trying to swim through oil-coated water, screaming for help as strong currents pulled them under. The sounds of splintering wood and cries for rescue echoed through the harbor. Rescue efforts began while the storm still raged. British Navy personnel from the HMS Tamar risked their lives by launching lifeboats into the rough water, pulling dozens of people to safety. Police and fire crews also worked to save those trapped on the docks and in partially sunken ships. Some managed to haul survivors up by ropes and ladders, even as the wind threatened to blow them into the sea themselves. Others could only watch helplessly as overturned boats floated past with no signs of life on board. One of the most heartbreaking scenes unfolded near Aberdeen, on the southern side of Hong Kong Island. A fleet of fishing boats had tried to take shelter in the narrow inlet there, but the wind shifted suddenly and a massive wave surged into the harbor mouth. Within minutes, more than 40 boats were overturned or crushed together. Entire families were lost, including children and elderly relatives who had been asleep below deck when the storm hit. As the winds finally began to weaken around midday, the damage was already staggering. Oil from damaged freighters spread across the water, mixing with floating debris, splintered wood, and unclaimed belongings. The sea, once the heart of Hong Kong's lifeline, had become a floating graveyard. The worst was not yet over, though. Survivors began emerging from shelters, only to find their homes destroyed and loved ones missing. With communication lines down and roads blocked, news of the disaster spread slowly. It would take several more days before the full human cost became known. As we wrap up, we'll explore the impact on land, how entire neighborhoods were flattened, how hospitals struggled to keep up with the wounded, and how the government began the long and painful process of recovering from one of the worst typhoons in Hong Kong's history. In the aftermath of the typhoon, the people of Hong Kong faced a long road to recovery. In the weeks that followed, efforts to clear debris and restore order were carried out mostly by hand, using basic tools. Communication lines had been knocked out, and it took days before messages could be sent to nearby cities for assistance. Supplies were slow to arrive. What little help did come had to be delivered by sea, as many roads were blocked or destroyed. The colonial government conducted an inquiry to understand how the storm had caused so much damage and loss of life. Reports from that time revealed not only the limits of existing infrastructure, but also how ill-prepared the region was for a storm of that strength. The storm pushed the city to think more seriously about long-term planning. In the years that followed, improvements were made to breakwaters and harbor facilities. More attention was given to weather observation, and the typhoon warning system was gradually expanded. But for the people who lived through it, the typhoon left a permanent scar. Many survivors lost their homes, their families, or their livelihoods. For fishermen and harbor workers in particular, the disaster was devastating. Some left the region entirely, while others stayed and rebuilt, one wall at a time. The 1906 Hong Kong typhoon is still remembered today as one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. It highlighted the need for better preparedness, better infrastructure, and better understanding of nature's power. While the city has grown into a modern metropolis over the past century, the memory of that storm remains a reminder that even the most advanced societies are never fully in control when it comes to the force of nature. Mount Pelée sat quietly on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean for a long time. Most people living nearby had no memory of it ever erupting. It had shown some signs of activity in the past, small eruptions in the years 1792 and 1851, but nothing that caused real fear. Because of this, people thought of the volcano as more of a natural landmark than a threat. Life in the town of Saint-Pierre, just over 6 miles south of the mountain's summit, went on as usual. It was a busy and beautiful place known as the Paris of the Caribbean, with shops, schools, a theater, and busy streets. In early April of the year 1902, a few locals noticed something odd. People hiking near the mountain reported strange smells like rotten eggs coming from the summit. These smells were from sulfur gases leaking out of small cracks called fumaroles. But sulfur fumes weren't all that new for the area, and no one thought much of it. That changed on April 23rd when the volcano let out its first real sign of trouble. A light rain of ash and small rocks fell on the southern and western sides of the mountain. Tremors shook the ground. People in the nearby villages felt it, but most still believed it would pass. By April 25th, a dark cloud of ash and rock shot up from the volcano's top. It looked frightening, but it didn't do much damage. Even then, local leaders didn't raise the alarm. On April 26th, another blast dusted nearby towns in gray ash. The volcano was clearly waking up, but officials continued to believe it posed no serious risk. 2 days later, on April 27th, a group of curious hikers made their way up to the summit. What they saw was shocking. The once dry Etong Sec crater was now a lake, boiling and steaming. A cone of volcanic debris, about 50 feet high, had formed beside it. Hot water poured into the lake, and the deep rumbling from below the earth sounded like a huge pot boiling over. The smell of sulfur had become so strong that it reached the streets of Saint-Pierre, causing people and animals to gag or flee indoors. By the end of April, rivers running down the mountain swelled. Some carried trees and boulders with them. Ash started falling steadily on villages like Précheur and Saint-Philomène. Even though these were clear warning signs, people living in and around Saint-Pierre still didn't leave. Many believed the volcano would settle down again, just like it had in the past. Others thought the city was too far from danger. After all, it was over 6 miles from the summit. On the night of May 2nd, around 11:30, the volcano exploded again. It sent out a huge black cloud of ash and pumice, and the explosions grew louder. The ground trembled. Ash rained down on the northern half of the island, and the air became hard to breathe. These blasts were now happening every 5 or 6 hours. Even with all of this happening, life in Saint-Pierre mostly went on as usual. People were nervous, but there was no order to leave, no official word telling them what to do. That weekend, a local newspaper decided to cancel a picnic planned for May 4th, just to be safe. It was one of the few signs that people were starting to worry. Farm animals, however, had already begun dying from starvation and thirst. Their food and water had been covered in ash, making it impossible for them to eat or drink. The island was clearly changing, but the people didn't fully realize what was coming. In the days ahead, things would go from bad to deadly. And yet, even as the ground rumbled beneath their feet and the sky darkened with ash, most people stayed put, unaware that their time was running out. By the end of April in the year 1902, the signs coming from Mount Pelée were growing harder to ignore. Even though many locals still believed there wasn't much to worry about, the mountain was changing quickly. Ash was falling almost daily, and the smell of sulfur filled the air around Saint-Pierre. Nearby rivers started to swell with muddy water, carrying fallen trees and rocks down from the slopes. On April 27th, some people climbed up to check out the Etang Sec crater. They found a lake of boiling water nearly 200 meters across, with steam hissing from deep underground and a strong sulfur smell in the air. That same smell drifted as far as the city of Saint-Pierre, which was over 6 kilometers away. Farm animals were beginning to suffer too. With ash covering the ground and falling into streams, there was no clean water or grass for them to eat. The air burned the lungs, and horses and cattle were getting sick or dying. Still, the local government didn't take serious action. The mayor and other officials were more focused on an upcoming election. Even though the volcano was getting louder and more aggressive each day, they insisted that everything was under control. On May 2nd, at around 11:30 at night, Mount Pelée let out a huge explosion. A thick black cloud of ash and smoke shot up into the sky. Earthquakes shook the ground, and the entire northern part of the island was soon covered in a layer of gray dust. The noise could be heard for miles, and even the ground itself seemed to be groaning under the pressure. But despite the chaos, people still stayed in the city. Some were scared but didn't know where else to go. Others simply trusted that the worst had passed. There were more explosions through the night and into the next day. Every 5 to 6 hours, the volcano would erupt again, the sky darkened, and the air was thick with ash. Even breathing became harder. Still, there was no official order to evacuate. Instead, there were efforts to calm the population. Newspapers printed updates but didn't sound the alarm. In fact, one local paper had planned a picnic on the mountain for May 4th, but ended up postponing it, not because of fear of the volcano, but because of poor visibility from the ash. On May 5th, things took a deadly turn. A powerful mud flow came rushing down the southwest side of the mountain. It smashed into a sugar mill, burying around 150 people and sweeping debris all the way to the sea. The mud flow hit the ocean with such force that it triggered 3 separate tsunamis. These waves damaged coastal buildings, sank boats, and caused panic among the people living near the water. That night, the volcano exploded again, but this time the clouds weren't just dark smoke. Parts of the eruption were glowing. Lava had finally reached the surface, marking a major shift in the eruption's behavior. By now, Mount Pelée was fully awake, and its power was growing. The eruptions were no longer just about steam and gas. Real magma was involved now, which meant the danger was about to reach a whole new level. And still, with everything that had happened, Saint-Pierre remained full of people. Residents, shopkeepers, families, and even refugees from nearby villages who thought the city would be a safe place to ride out the storm. They couldn't have known that they were waiting at the foot of one of the most deadly volcanic eruptions in modern history. By May 6th, the atmosphere in Saint-Pierre had shifted from nervousness to unease. The skies were darker than usual, filled with thick ash clouds that blocked out the sun. Street lamps stayed lit during the day, and layers of ash coated the rooftops, trees, and streets like gray snow. Breathing was difficult, and many people covered their faces with damp cloths. Horses, birds, and pets were found dead from the poor air quality, and the smell of sulfur never went away. Still, ships continued to arrive in the harbor, and life carried on as best as it could. Inside government buildings, officials tried to maintain order. The governor of Martinique, Louis Moutet, had recently visited the city with his wife. He wanted to reassure citizens that they were not in danger. He even moved into the city for a few days to calm fears. At the same time, reports were coming in from across the island about the mountain's activity, small earthquakes, boiling mud, glowing gas, and loud explosions, but the response remained the same: stay calm. Meanwhile, Mount Pelée was going through serious internal changes. A lava dome had begun forming inside the crater. This meant magma was rising to the surface, but being trapped beneath hardened rock. The pressure beneath this cap was increasing rapidly, and gas was building up faster than it could escape. On May 7th, another powerful explosion blew ash and rocks thousands of meters into the air. Some stones fell into the city, crashing through roofs and damaging homes. People were now seriously frightened, but most still remained. Many didn't have the means to leave, and others believed the worst had already happened. In the hills around the volcano, entire forests were dying from the toxic gases. Banana trees and sugar cane fields turned black. Streams ran hot, and fish floated to the surface, dead. The ground cracked in strange patterns, and wild animals fled or dropped where they stood. But inside Saint-Pierre, many still held on to hope. Markets were open, churches held services, and people tried to continue their lives even as the ground shook beneath them. On that same day, scientists visiting the area tried to gather data about the volcano's behavior. They noticed that the gas emissions were becoming more violent and that the shape of the crater had changed. But their warnings went mostly unheard. The newspapers printed short updates but downplayed the danger. There was a strong sense of denial throughout the island's leadership. In their view, Saint-Pierre was too important to lose. It was the economic and cultural heart of the island, and abandoning it would have been unthinkable. What no one realized was that Mount Pelée had become something far more dangerous than anyone had seen before. It wasn't just releasing steam and ash, it was preparing for a type of eruption almost no one on the island understood. And with each hour that passed, the force inside the mountain kept growing, pushing toward the moment when everything would change forever. On the morning of May the 8th, 1902, Saint-Pierre woke to a strange stillness. The usual tremors had stopped. The sky was heavy with ash, but there was no wind, no birds, and no sound from the mountain. Many residents took this quiet as a sign that the worst had passed. Others were too exhausted to think clearly, having spent the last several nights in fear. Despite the chaos of the past days, thousands still remained in the city. Families, merchants, teachers, and workers who had nowhere else to go. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Mount Pelée unleashed one of the most violent eruptions in recorded history. Without warning, a massive explosion tore through the mountain's side. What followed was not lava, but a deadly blast known as a pyroclastic surge. A fast-moving cloud of superheated gas, ash, and rock that raced down the slope at speeds faster than any human could outrun. This surge reached Saint-Pierre in less than 1 minute. The wave of heat was so intense that it ignited everything in its path: wood, clothing, and even people. Buildings were flattened or caught fire instantly. Ships anchored in the harbor burst into flames. Stone structures crumbled, glass shattered. The surge didn't just burn, it crushed and suffocated. Those who tried to flee had no chance. The temperature of the cloud was high enough to kill instantly, and the pressure destroyed lungs before people could take their final breath. Within minutes, the entire city was in ruins. Fires broke out across neighborhoods, turning Saint-Pierre into a smoking wasteland. The eruption didn't stop there. It continued to release ash and gas into the atmosphere, covering the surrounding landscape in darkness. For those observing from other parts of Martinique, the view was horrifying. A giant black column rising from the volcano, shaped like a mushroom cloud, glowing with lightning and flame. In the days that followed, rescue teams arrived to search the wreckage. What they found was devastating. Of the nearly 30,000 people who had been in Saint-Pierre that morning, almost none had survived. The city, once called the Paris of the Caribbean, had been completely erased in less than 5 minutes. The only known survivor from the city center was a man named Ludger Silbaris, a prisoner locked inside a small windowless jail cell that protected him from the heat and ash. His survival was considered a miracle. Mount Pelée's eruption shocked the world. It was not just a natural disaster, it was a warning about how little was understood about volcanoes at the time. The pyroclastic surge, a type of eruption rarely documented before, introduced a new level of destruction that scientists would study for decades to come. But for Martinique, the loss was immediate and unforgettable. One of its most important cities had vanished, and the scars left behind would never fully heal. After the destruction of Saint-Pierre, the island of Martinique was left in mourning. Entire families were gone, and the cultural heart of the island had been wiped out. Survivors from nearby villages struggled to process what had happened. Many had lost loved ones, homes, and livelihoods in an instant. The scale of the disaster was hard to grasp, even for those who had seen the ash and flames with their own eyes. News of the eruption reached the rest of the world quickly. In France and across Europe, headlines described the death of a city. Relief efforts began almost immediately. Ships arrived carrying supplies, doctors, and volunteers. But there was little that could be done. The area around Saint-Pierre was still dangerous. Ash covered the ground like snow. Buildings were unrecognizable, and fires smoldered for days. It would take weeks to recover the dead, and in many cases, nothing remained to bury. One of the most notable outcomes of the disaster was the change it brought to scientific understanding. Geologists from different countries came to study the eruption and its aftermath. Mount Pelée became a key case for the study of pyroclastic flows, which had previously been misunderstood. Researchers also noted the strange weather that followed the eruption, including red sunsets and ash clouds that drifted across the Atlantic. The volcano's behavior helped shape modern methods of monitoring and predicting eruptions. Despite this progress, Mount Pelée remained active. Smaller eruptions occurred in the years that followed, including one in the year 1905. These events slowed the rebuilding process. Although a new settlement eventually formed near the ruins, Saint-Pierre never regained its former importance. The capital of Martinique was moved to Fort-de-France, where most government and trade activities remain today. The story of Saint-Pierre and Mount Pelée lives on through memorials, museums, and local storytelling. The preserved remains of the city still attract visitors who want to understand what happened on that terrible morning. The old prison cell where Ludger Silbaris survived can still be seen. His survival was used in traveling exhibitions, and he later joined a circus in the United States, where he shared his story. The eruption of May 8, 1902, stands as one of the deadliest volcanic events in history. It serves as a reminder of nature's unpredictable power and the importance of preparation. While Saint-Pierre could not have been saved with the knowledge of the time, the lessons learned from its loss have helped protect other communities around the world. Today, Mount Pelée is closely monitored, and the tragedy that once struck the island remains a powerful part of Martinique's identity. In the early morning hours of April 29, 1903, a disaster struck the small mining town of Frank, in what was then the District of Alberta in the Northwest Territories. It happened so suddenly, so violently, that within seconds, an entire mountain side came crashing down, burying everything in its path. This catastrophic event, known as the Frank Slide, remains one of Canada's deadliest landslides, and a chilling reminder of nature's raw and unpredictable power. Frank was a young town, established just 2 years before, in 1901, when rich coal seams were discovered at the base of Turtle Mountain. It was named after Henry Frank, one of the owners of the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company, which operated the mine that fueled the town's economy. The settlement quickly grew, attracting miners and their families, as well as businesses looking to capitalize on the booming industry. By April of 1903, Frank had a population of about 600 people. It had 4 hotels, a 2-story school, and a bustling main street. However, there were signs that all was not well with Turtle Mountain. The Blackfoot and Tunaxa indigenous peoples had long referred to it as the mountain that moves, warning that the land was unstable. Scientists today know that the mountain was made up of layers of hard limestone sitting on top of much softer rock. Over time, water had seeped into cracks in the rock, eroding it from the inside. This natural instability was made worse by the coal mining operations that had been carving tunnels deep into the mountain. As miners dug out coal, they unknowingly weakened the mountain's structure even further. In the months leading up to the slide, miners noticed troubling signs. Small tremors shook the tunnels, coal broke loose from its seams unexpectedly, and pressure seemed to be building inside the mountain. Some workers even described hearing deep, unsettling rumblings from within Turtle Mountain, like the growl of something massive and restless. But despite these warning signs, the town carried on with business as usual. Then on that fateful night, disaster struck. A sudden cold snap followed an unusually wet winter, likely worsening the already fragile conditions within Turtle Mountain. At exactly 4:10 in the morning, a deafening roar shattered the silence. A massive section of the mountain, measuring over 1,000 meters wide and more than 400 meters high, suddenly gave way. In mere seconds, an astonishing 82 million tons of limestone rock came crashing down the valley, moving at over 100 kilometers per hour. The rock slide was so powerful that it shot across the valley floor and even climbed up the opposite hillside before finally coming to rest. The force of the slide obliterated everything in its path. A 2-kilometer stretch of the Canadian Pacific Railway was completely buried. The coal mine's buildings vanished beneath a sea of stone. Homes and businesses on the eastern edge of Frank were instantly crushed. Some residents were likely still asleep when the avalanche of rock swallowed them whole. The sound of the disaster was heard as far away as Cochrane, over 200 kilometers to the north. As the dust settled, the true horror of what had happened began to emerge. Dozens of families had been buried alive. The once thriving town was now a broken landscape of shattered buildings and lifeless stone. The people of Frank had just experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in Canadian history, and in the coming hours, they would have to face an unimaginable reality, one that would change their town forever. But in the midst of the destruction, a few remarkable survival stories would soon emerge. The days leading up to the Frank slide were filled with subtle warnings, signs that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of the disaster that was about to unfold. However, at the time, these signals were either ignored or dismissed as part of the natural behavior of Turtle Mountain. The people of Frank, like many small mining towns, were focused on their daily lives, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Miners working deep inside the tunnels of the Canadian American Coal and Coke Company had begun to notice unsettling changes. Coal seams that once required hard labor to extract were now breaking apart with little effort, as if the mountain itself was loosening its grip. Some workers even reported hearing deep rumbling sounds from within the earth, though no one could agree on their cause. To many, it was simply the groaning of the mountain, a normal occurrence in a place where rock and coal had been mined for years. Outside the mine, strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. Over the winter, cracks had appeared along the eastern face of Turtle Mountain, widening as snowmelt and rainfall seeped into them. When temperatures dropped at night, the water froze, expanding within the fractures and further weakening the already unstable rock. The cycle repeated over and over, slowly but relentlessly pushing the mountain toward collapse. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Blackfoot and Kakatunaksa, had long warned that Turtle Mountain was unpredictable. Their oral histories spoke of a mountain that moves, a place that should be avoided. They had noticed the way the land shifted, the way the slopes never seemed to remain the same. But as settlers moved in and the mining industry expanded, these warnings were largely ignored. After all, coal mining was booming, and the town of Frank was growing quickly. People were focused on opportunity, not on what the mountain might do. In the days leading up to the disaster, the warnings became impossible to ignore. Small tremors rattled the town, shaking dishes on shelves and waking light sleepers in the middle of the night. On multiple occasions, sections of rock broke loose from the mountain's surface, tumbling down in minor landslides. Though unsettling, these events were not enough to stop daily operations. Life in Frank continued as usual, with miners reporting for work, trains running on schedule, and families going about their routines. Then, on the evening of April 28th, something even more disturbing happened. Workers inside the mine reported a sudden, powerful burst of coal gas, an explosive release of methane trapped within the rock. The force of the blast sent dust and debris flying through the tunnels, startling the miners. Many saw it as a bad omen, but with no real proof of danger. There was little they could do. Some men went home that night with an uneasy feeling, but others brushed it off as just another strange occurrence in a town built beneath an unpredictable mountain. As the town of Frank settled in for the night, no one could have known that within hours, Turtle Mountain would come crashing down, unleashing one of the deadliest landslides in Canadian history. In the early morning hours of April 29th, the residents of Frank were fast asleep, unaware that their town was about to be buried under a massive rock slide. Just before dawn, Turtle Mountain finally gave way. Without warning, a section of its eastern face collapsed, sending an avalanche of limestone boulders hurtling down at terrifying speed. The ground shook violently as millions of tons of rock broke free, crushing everything in their path. The slide moved with incredible force, covering over 2 miles in less than 2 minutes. Entire sections of the town were swallowed, homes and buildings vanishing beneath a sea of debris. The sound of the collapse was deafening. Those who survived described it as a thunderous roar that seemed to last forever. Some compared it to the sound of a massive explosion, while others recalled the deep, earth-shaking rumble that had woken them from sleep. Among the hardest hit areas was a row of houses located at the base of the mountain. Families were still inside, unaware of the danger until it was too late. Many were buried instantly as the rocks crashed down, their homes reduced to rubble in seconds. The slide also wiped out a portion of the Canadian American Coal and Coke Company's mine entrance, trapping workers underground. Miraculously, some miners deep inside the tunnels managed to survive as the collapse sealed off their exit, but left an air pocket intact. The destruction extended beyond the town itself. A section of the railway that connected Frank to the rest of the region was completely buried, cutting off communication and transportation. A passing train had been scheduled to travel through the area that morning, but by sheer luck, it had been running behind schedule, avoiding certain disaster. As the dust settled, the once thriving town of Frank was left in ruins. Survivors who had escaped the initial collapse were met with an eerie silence. What had once been homes, streets, and businesses was now an endless stretch of jagged rock. In the chaos, people began to search desperately for their loved ones, calling out names and digging through the rubble with their bare hands. The sheer scale of the devastation made rescue efforts difficult, and as the sun rose over the mountains, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. As the morning light revealed the devastation, the survivors of Frank struggled to make sense of what had happened. The once bustling mining town was now buried beneath an unrecognizable landscape of shattered limestone. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, but with so much destruction, the chances of finding survivors grew slimmer by the hour. Many were trapped under tons of rock, and rescuers had little more than their hands and primitive tools to dig through the debris. News of the disaster spread quickly. By sunrise, word had reached nearby communities, and help was on the way. Early on April 30th, a special train from Fort Macleod arrived, carrying Northwest Mounted Police officers and doctors ready to assist with rescue and recovery efforts. The scene was overwhelming. Piles of boulders the size of houses covered what had once been homes and businesses. The force of the slide had been so immense that it had even pushed debris up the opposite side of the valley. Despite the destruction, there were stories of incredible survival. Some miners, trapped inside the tunnels when the entrance collapsed, managed to find their way out through secondary shafts, stumbling into the daylight, covered in dust but unharmed. One of the most astonishing discoveries was that of a horse named Charlie, who had been trapped underground for over a month. He survived by licking moisture from the tunnel walls and chewing on wooden support beams. When workers finally freed him, they celebrated by giving him a feast of oats and brandy. Unfortunately, the sudden intake of food was too much for the animal, and he died shortly after. Amid the relief efforts, geologists and engineers began to assess the stability of the mountain, fearing another collapse. Some believed that the rock slide had been triggered by coal mining operations that had weakened Turtle Mountain's structure. Others pointed to the region's natural instability, noting that local indigenous groups had long referred to Turtle Mountain as the mountain that moves. Scientists sent by the Geological Survey of Canada inspected the mountain's peak and found new cracks forming, raising concerns about whether another rock slide could follow. Authorities debated whether to evacuate the remaining residents of Frank. Some officials insisted that it was too dangerous to stay, while others argued that the worst had already happened. In the end, the government allowed the town to remain, though certain areas were permanently abandoned. Years later, parts of the town would be relocated further from the mountain, as the threat of another slide could never be ruled out entirely. In the aftermath of the Frank slide, the town faced the difficult task of rebuilding. Though many families left, unwilling to risk another disaster, others chose to stay, determined to rebuild their lives in the shadow of Turtle Mountain. Over time, new structures were built, and the community adapted to the ever-present risk that loomed above them. The disaster also led to increased efforts to study and monitor the mountain. Scientists continued to investigate the causes of the slide, trying to determine whether human activity had played a role or if the collapse had been inevitable. The conclusion remained debated, but one thing was certain: Turtle Mountain was still shifting. Decades later, in the 20th century, monitoring systems were installed to track the mountain's movement, helping to predict any future rock slides before they could claim more lives. Though the town of Frank never fully recovered, the memory of the slide became an important part of Canadian history. The site of the disaster remains a haunting reminder of nature's power, with massive boulders still scattered across the valley unchanged since the moment they fell. Visitors from around the world come to see the landscape frozen in time, walking among the ruins of homes and businesses that were lost in the early hours of that tragic morning. The story of the Frank slide is not just one of destruction, but of resilience. Those who survived carried on, their lives forever changed, but their determination unshaken. Today, the site serves as both a historical landmark and a cautionary tale, a place where the past and present exist side by side, reminding all who visit of the unstoppable forces that shape our world.